So Matthew, long known for as the most Jewish of the Gospels, is being now read as a thoroughgoingly Jewish text within Judaism. It's happening with Mark's Gospel, Luke's Gospel, so the other Gospels as well. You mentioned Paul earlier and how much Paul gets discussed these days in New Testament scholarship. Paul, probably one of the biggest things to be happening over the last 10, 15 years of Pauline scholarship is reading Paul within Judaism, right? So reading Paul and his letters as Jewish texts expressing Jewish theology, even though, of course, they have an eye towards what are we doing about Gentiles, right? Not non-Jews. So it's been a seismic shift in a lot of New Testament thinking on the scholarly level, which hopefully more and more can penetrate and start to trickle down into congregations and people who are reading the New Testament as an authority for their lives, right?
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Wally Cirafesi, and we'll be discussing his Journal of Biblical Literature article, Rethinking John and the Synagogue in Light of Expulsion from Public Assemblies in Antiquity. And there, the synagogue is placed in quotes. This is not the first podcast that shines a light on the New Testament by framing study away from what I think is pretty long and nasty history of antisemitism. In his article, he approaches an interpretation of the term aposynagogues, and I'm probably saying that wrong, aposynagogues, throughout the book of John, which is the only place that this word appears. And the thesis that he's arguing against posits that there's a much larger idea being represented here of Jesus' followers being expelled from a larger synagogue rather than someone being expelled from a single synagogue. And he looks at how public assemblies, specifically synagogues, operated throughout the ancient world, throughout the Greco-Roman world, to give us a better picture to understand this through. So I really appreciate him sitting down, and I really appreciate his article. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Wally Cirafesi. Wally Cirafesi, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Jared. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, currently I work at Lund University in the Center for Theology and Religious Studies here in southern Sweden. I'm also a what's called a Pro Futura Scientia Fellow at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies. So I wear two hats that are very tightly integrated, but split between two institutions right now. But I work in New Testament studies. That's my field. Although the way that I conceive of New Testament studies is much broader than just the 27 books that we know of as the New Testament. So I work a lot in Jewish studies. I work a lot in archaeology, and then in the time periods that go well beyond the New Testament as well. So into a period of time that we call late antiquity, up to about the 7th century AD. So I like to do different things, as you maybe would be able to tell, but I'm a trained New Testament scholar. I've worked a lot, especially on the Gospel of John, and that's been the primary part of my background to this point.
Nice. So working really hard to stay employable is what I got from that.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair way to put it. Those of us who've tried to make a career out of this thing, biblical studies, it's as you probably know, a really tough job market. So anything you can do to be as marketable as possible, you do it. Yep.
Yeah.
So you're exactly right.
I think you are my first. I've talked to people who have done work in Johannine literature, but you're the first one that I'm talking to about Johannine literature. So I'm realizing the gradient toward Pauline literature when you talk to New Testament people. It's so easy to just find yourself just sliding into talking about Paul. I'm actually thinking about maybe for 2025, a deliberate, I'm going to talk about any New Testament work but Paul for 2025.
Yeah.
But so the article that we're discussing today, it's from the most recent Journal of Biblical Literature, the one that came out in January, Rethinking John and, quote, the Synagogue, end quote, in light of expulsion from public assemblies in antiquity. So I usually really want to start with the positive assertion, but that's tough with this one because it's so, what you're saying is so wrapped up in the thing that you are pushing back against. So I'll say
Yeah.
it's up to you. Which would you prefer? Would you prefer to state a positive thesis or to talk about what you're pushing back against?
Yeah, probably what I'm pushing back against. I think you're right that it's definitely a reactionary piece in a lot of ways, based on the.
Let's say reactive. Let's be
Yeah,
careful
how
with the
about
word
that?
reactionary.
Sure, reactive. There's a problem, and in some ways, all scholarship, I think, is reacting right against either some sort of long held view or some sort of problem that's perceived in the scholarly arena. And so, yeah, so it's maybe a little bit easier to do it that way. The idea that I'm trying to engage is in the Gospel of John, we have these passages, 3 times it's mentioned, where Christ believers in some way, shape, or form are being aposynagogoed, right? They're being expelled from or kicked out of or in some way put out from the synagogue, right? Or synagogue or assembly or something like that, depending on how you translate it. And for a long time, scholarship has either assumed or mostly assumed, sometimes there's some argumentation for it, but mostly assumed that this word that John uses, which is it's a Johannine word, that's not used in any other literature outside of New Testament. It's a Gospel of John term. The assumption has been this is John expressing this idea that Christ believers and therefore Christianity is on its way out of Judaism, right, or outside of Jewish identity, Jewish faith and practice, these kinds of things. These passages in John 9 and John 12 and then John 16 have been interpreted to say that John represents a break with Judaism as a whole, right? And so it's this parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, and these words represent that. And I've suggested that actually, no, that's not the case, especially when we look at, from a historical perspective, synagogues, and then even looking at synagogues within this larger context of public assemblies in antiquity and the kind of social conventions that surrounded this idea of being driven out of something, being driven out or being put outside of an assembly. And none of our sources that we have ever indicate that being put outside of an assembly like this, whether we're talking about a synagogue specifically as a quote unquote Jewish or a Jewish oriented type of assembly or a Greco-Roman assembly, none of our sources suggest that being put outside of one of these assemblies represents a loss of one's ethno-religious identity, right? It's not being put out, you're not being put out of an ethnic group, which Jews and Judaism represented in antiquity, but even beyond. So it plays a part of a larger reading strategy that I've been writing about and advocating for a while now, about the idea that we should read John's gospel as a whole, but specifically these aposynagogos passages as within Judaism, right? So there's some sort of conflict, some sort of tension, contention happening certainly within the story world of John's gospel, but it's not between Jews and Christians, synagogue and church, but something that's happening within Judaism and within synagogue spaces specifically. So that's a snapshot of what the article is about and what my larger work really has been about as well.
And so you reference, at least in the abstract and in the and in the article proper, it seems like largely this is centered around J. Lewis Martin and Raymond E. Brown. Did it start with them, or is this
Yeah.
older than them?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think certainly J. Lewis Martin or J. Louis Martin and then his colleague Raymond Brown were the ones who standardized, I think, this idea of a historical Johannine community that existed behind or exists behind the pages of the Gospel of John. And therefore, what John's story world represents is really a representation or some sort of expression of an actual socio-historical community and its experiences, right? When you read Aposinagogos or you read the expulsion passages, what you're really reading about, what John's really writing about is the experiences of this community that produced the gospel in some kind of way. And these theories get really complicated when they talk about how the gospel should be sliced and diced up to different redactionary or editorial layers and so on and so forth. So I'm not so interested in that. But the idea that John somehow should be read on these sort of two levels, right? A Johannine community behind the text, it certainly predates J. Louis Martin. You can see it, of course, in the work of Rudolf Bultmann, who was a early 20th century German theologian and New Testament scholar. You see it even, I think, in late 19th and early 20th century scholarship too. But it was really Martin who, I think, began to conceptualize that this Johannine community was a quote unquote Jewish Christian community. So he was actually much stronger on the Jewish roots, so to say, of the Johannine community and where this text is coming from. But from his perspective, what aposynagogues meant was that actually members of this Johannine community are stepping out of the synagogue and into the church, as if there's some sort of separation or some sort of severing that's happening both in the pages of John and then behind John historically as well. So I think the theory does go much further back than just J. Louis Martin, but he was certainly, and then of course Raymond Brown were certainly the ones who solidified it and made it almost like a standard view in Johannine scholarship.
But you're saying, okay, so one, this word doesn't exist anywhere else.
Yeah,
So there's no
it's a
other,
Johannine theology.
there's no literature to compare it to. But your contention is just looking at this text, that's not how it works. And when we broaden our field of regard out and we look at what synagogues were, we start to see that they look more like collegia or ecclesia, which are words around the Mediterranean, the Roman world. And they're really just public gatherings. That's what you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah. I mean,
We
more or
won't. I
less.
won't belabor the point about trying to talk about what they were saying. But now I'm
Yeah.
wondering. Hold on. So they're zooming out and saying, "Oh, there's something bigger being said here," and you're zooming out and saying that does not match with what we find on the ground, the actual data.
Yeah, and I think perhaps a major methodological point that my work, at least especially in this article, is trying to establish is that I'm not trying to read behind the text necessarily. You can do that. I'm not necessarily rejecting that wholesale, but I do less of reading behind the text, what's happening on a historical level with this Johannine community, and try to read the events that John is actually recounting on the level of the text, right? And to try to understand if we read the story world, right? So like the narrative world of John's gospel in a particular context, i.e., like what we know about ancient synagogues, particularly public synagogue, right? So you mentioned the collegia, especially, or collegia-like synagogues that were more like Greco-Roman associations. That's possible, and some scholars have done that. But I'm suggesting that we try to look at the public institution, right? That this public idea that we have about synagogues from antiquity, and then also Greco-Roman public institutions, which seems to coincide more, in my opinion, with John's narrative world, right? The synagogue or synagogues in John's narrative world are open access public institutions, it seems like to me at least. And so I'm suggesting that when we read the narrative world within that particular historical context, then we come out with a pretty different result with respect to this question about whether John's story world, whether John as a text intends to move its readers away from and outside of Judaism and Jewish identity, or whether it's meant to keep its readership within Jewishness and Jewish identity. So it's really a methodological difference in a lot of ways. What Martin and some of those other guys did, and lots of people continue to do today, is read behind the text, read the gospel on these sort of two levels. I'm just trying to take the story world itself and set that within a social and historical context that allow us to read that part of John a bit differently.
It seems like that's an uphill battle too, though, because the conception is honestly anything to do with New Testament studies as it relates to Judaism is indelibly linked to the world outside of this room that I'm sitting in right now. If I'm reading a New Testament text and I got the understanding that there is a clear bifurcation between what is Christian, what is Jewish, it does seem like what you're saying could be a reparative message, but it's going to be told to people reading the New Testament, which are not, to my knowledge, statistically people who identify as Jewish. So
Absolutely. Yeah,
that's a
you're
pretty
absolutely right.
heavy lift. How do you see that? How would you see this being integrated by people who are engaging with biblical text, which is statistically in the practice of worship?
Yeah, yeah. So these are great questions, Jared, and you're putting your finger on something I think that is happening within New Testament studies as a whole right now. So if I could put this particular article that we're discussing within the larger setting of some things that are happening in New Testament scholarship. So this article comes out of my thinking on a book that I wrote on John within Judaism. And that book is very much situated within a larger trend in New Testament scholarship of reading the New Testament within Judaism. In other words, reading the New Testament as not Christian literature or Christian scripture, so to say, but as part of this sort of diverse, ideologically diverse, culturally diverse world of Second Temple Judaism. So reading the New Testament as Jewish literature rather than quote unquote Christian literature. And of course, we get it. We could dive into the nitty gritties of terminology, right? But the terminology actually isn't so important as much as the ideas that we associate with that terminology, right? And so, for a long time, I think scholarship has begun to problematize that certainly within the time of the New Testament itself, there actually is no bifurcation or division between what we call Jewish and what we call Christian. Christianity didn't exist, right? During the time of Jesus, during the time of Paul, during the time the New Testament is being written and coming together as literature, Christianity doesn't exist yet, right? The first time that we actually have the term Christianity used is not until the 2nd century in Ignatius of Antioch, where he talks about Christianismos, or Christianity, is not and should not be practiced, right? Iudaismos, like Judaism. So he's the first to draw this really strong distinction between the two, which in my opinion suggests that in Ignatius's own day and his context, members of his own congregation, his readers, didn't distinguish between the two at all. Christianity, what he knew as Christianity, was simply an expression of Judaism. This is happening in a scholarship on Matthew's gospel, for instance. So Matthew, long known for as the most Jewish of the gospels, is being now read as a thoroughgoingly Jewish text within Judaism. It's happening with Mark's gospel, Luke's gospel, so the other gospels as well. You mentioned Paul earlier, right? And how much Paul gets discussed these days in New Testament scholarship. Paul, I mean, probably one of the biggest things to be happening over the last 10, 15 years of Pauline scholarship is reading Paul within Judaism, right? So reading Paul and his letters as Jewish texts expressing Jewish theology, even though, of course, they have an eye towards what are we doing about Gentiles, right? Not non-Jews. So it's been a seismic shift in a lot of New Testament thinking on the scholarly level, which hopefully more and more can penetrate and start to trickle down into congregations and people who are reading the New Testament as an authority for their lives, right? It's something that they have to come to grips with, that there is something about these texts that are bound up with Jewishness. And for a long time, for generations and really centuries of Christian scholarship on the New Testament has been built on this idea of supersessionism, right? That Christianity has supplanted and done away with Judaism and Jewish identity. And now we have Christianity as the locus of all that God is doing in the world, so on and so forth. But I think scholars are pointing to the fact that really supersessionism as a concept, as a theological framework, is really nowhere to be found in the New Testament. If you read the New Testament historically within its 1st century Jewish environment, and it's hard to say what this means then for the average 21st century church-going reader of the New Testament. But certainly on some basic level, the challenge is to take off supersessionist glasses, your lenses, and put on a lens that really appreciates the Jewishness of the New Testament and the fact that our New Testament authors are not sharpening their theological axe, so to say, against Judaism, right, to suppress it and to reject it, but as an expression of Judaism in and around the 1st century of the Common Era. What I've done, I think, needs to be set within a much broader trend in New Testament scholarship. So whether it's Matthew and Paul or these other texts, other studies are being done now to really appreciate the Jewishness of the New Testament as a whole.
I think part of that exercise would probably be to acknowledge, and I feel like this is a pretty big part of your article, that Judaism is not in the ancient world a monolith. Even now,
Right.
it's not a monolith. You can find different denominations of it, but to say the synagogue, in quotes, is not accurate unless you are referring to maybe that structure over there that
Yeah.
someone just
Yeah.
got kicked out of, that you're not being,
Yeah.
it's not a single thing. So does understanding that help us understand anything about the Gospel of John?
Yeah, also a great question. This is how I open up the article, with trying to put my finger on something that I think has been a characteristic of a lot of reading of John's gospel, both from the scholarly perspective and from the sort of the lay perspective. Like nowhere in John, and really nowhere in the New Testament, do we have this idea of the synagogue as, like you said, a monolith, as some sort of static institution that represents all Jews and Judaism, right, as again a very monolithic, ethno-cultural, static, bound type of institution, right? So that kind of idea about the synagogue is a Christian invention that doesn't happen until second century with Justin Martyr. He has the seeds of it, and then it really blossoms in like the fourth, fifth century, especially, where you have more Christian anti-Judaism that is developed in the preaching and teaching of a lot of late antique Christian theologians, right? So the idea of the synagogue is actually has deeply anti-Jewish roots, and it's a Christian invention. John doesn't talk about the synagogue that way. Doesn't talk about synagogues in the plural that way, right? The synagogue is a local institution, right? Or synagogues are a local institution for John. It's something that is specific. It's also a public institution that is open and unbound. We also have lots of evidence outside of John and the socio-historical context of John where synagogues are diverse. As you mentioned, as you rightly mentioned, Judaism itself, right? Jews and Judaism are highly integrated in the larger Roman world. And so we should expect that the boundaries between what is Jewish and what is not Jewish to be very porous, right? And so it's a theological construct, right? The idea that you have the Jews or the synagogue as something that then we can other, if you're talking from a Christian perspective, for instance, you can sort of otherize, right, that, and then it becomes convenient then to talk about Jesus as against the synagogue, or Jesus is doing something new and different and something that we can get on board with. But John doesn't do that. That's a foreign idea that's imported from the outside into New Testament studies. And so most definitely, I think more scholars now today appreciate, right, the diversity of Jewish identity and Judaism in the first century and beyond, and then even today, by the way, like you also mentioned, it's a diverse phenomenon that sort of evades our attempt to just have this category of Jews, Judaism, the synagogue, and then just pour everything that we think it is into that. It's just the sources don't let on for that. So that then opens the door for reading synagogues in John's narrative world as a place where there can be contention, right? There's different modes of identity formation taking place. So this is where Christ confessors in John 9, for instance, where Christ confessors, those Jews who are shaping their identities around this idea of Jesus as Messiah, fit very well within this context of a synagogue institution that is highly diverse, competitive, right? Competitive identities that are being formed and shaped. So absolutely anything that gets us away from thinking about the synagogue and the Jews as monoliths, right? In our mentality, let's do that. Let's reject that and move towards diversity, move towards porousness and boundaries, and appreciating what a text like John does within that type of context.
I think it might be helpful maybe for people who are going to be sitting down with their English translation and reading the Gospel of John to maybe have an understanding. Okay, where did synagogues come from? So there's the temple, and that's like a point of worship. What's the point of having synagogue? Where did they come from?
Yeah. Okay, another great question, and we need hours and hours to talk about all of the details of it.
Clear.
Clear the calendar. That's right. So the origins of the synagogue is a debated thing. So when did synagogues start? It's an ongoing thing. Actually, my doctoral supervisor wrote his whole big dissertation on that topic. So I've tried to stay clear of that topic a little bit. We know for sure, there was really no doubt. We've got texts and archaeological evidence from at least the first, maybe even as early as the second century BCE, of buildings of an institution, particularly a public institution, that seems to fit this concept that we have of the synagogue or a synagogue, right, or an assembly, a socio-religious institution, right? So it's not just a place, it's not just a building, even though there are buildings identified as synagogues from the first century BCE and on. But of course, it's also a social institution. So there are things that happen, that take place in this type of institution that I'm calling a public synagogue. So you have the building, but you have things taking place in this building that have nothing to do with religion, right? As we typically conceive of religion today. So this is also another really problematic concept that we oftentimes bring and import back onto Jews back onto Judaism and synagogues in Jesus's time and even beyond, where we have this idea of religion and religious space, but actually synagogues are probably more are better conceived of as town halls. They're a place where people get together, they talk about village politics, they debate. They certainly have something like the Torah, right, the authoritative scripture, read and discussed, right, and we have evidence of dispute taking places right between members of a community over Torah interpretation. Synagogues could be libraries, they could be treasuries, they could be banquet halls, right? All of these kinds of things. So they're very multivalent, very multi-use type of institutions. So when we see Jesus stepping into a synagogue, for instance, in the Gospels, right, he's not stepping into a religious institution as we conceive of it, right? It's much more of a social institution that holds together Jewish tradition, Jews and Judaism itself not being necessarily a religion, but actually an ethnic category with its own expression of tradition, so on and so forth. So when Jesus gets up and reads from the Isaiah scroll in the Nazareth synagogue in Luke 4, what's he doing? From our perspective, he's doing something very religious, but actually he's probably more like standing up and reading something more akin to a foundational document in the Jewish community. It's more like a constitution type of idea, with then of course a debate ensuing, and then he actually gets driven out of the synagogue, and he actually gets, in John's terms, right, it gets kicked out of the synagogue. So synagogues are not necessarily religious spaces. They're public. They're like town centers. They have lots of different functions. They start certainly before the time of Jesus, and then they continue and they evolve and develop certainly, and they change, they morph after the time of Jesus into a different type of institution that we are maybe a bit more familiar with today. But in Jesus's time, we need to have a fundamentally different view of what the synagogue was than what we have, than looking towards the institution that we know of today, right, as the synagogue.
And I think it's important to remember that what you're talking about with public engagement, and that was another question I was going to, but public engagement is not, there aren't these cordoned off spaces called politics, called religion, called
Yeah,
whatever else we do out in
yeah,
public. That's life. And everyone who is invited into
absolutely.
public life has to take all of those different things into consideration. This is
Yeah,
it's a weird comparison, but it just popped into my head as you were talking. So, not to say that Jesus was doing anything silly, but my friends and I, when I
yeah.
was in high school, we went to a store. So here in Texas, we have HEB. We went into an
Okay.
HEB, and we got kicked out of the HEB at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. I
Okay.
happened to work at another HEB, and I was not, I think to your point, I was not
Yeah, yeah.
barred from that HEB. I had only been
No,
kicked out of this HEB. And
that's
again,
right.
I'm
That's
not
right.
saying that I was doing what Jesus did.
No,
However,
but
being kicked out of an HEB does not mean kicked out of all HEBs.
absolutely. I think that's actually a really fine contemporary analog, right? I think you have all of these kinds of things, right? You have like local specificity, right? You have a particular experience that's happening, maybe in the context of you getting kicked out of the first one that you mentioned. Maybe there was some sort of circumstances that arose that led to that, but it didn't. What there wasn't some sort of super local authority that just banned you from all of these places, right? And so this is also an important thing to realize about synagogues. There in Jesus's day, and I think arguably throughout much of the history of ancient Judaism, right, there is no supralocal authority that governs over what synagogues should be like, how synagogues function, how people function in synagogue spaces. They're almost always considered to be local specific institutions, right? And so you mentioned the Jerusalem temple. So if we're talking about Jesus' day when the temple is still standing, you have the temple courts, right? So it's not just a sanctuary space where sacrifices are offered, but you do have the temple courts, which are also a public arena for different types of gatherings before 70 CE when the temple is destroyed. The temple seems to be a super local institution, right, where Jews from all over the Mediterranean world come, and especially for pilgrimage and those kinds of things. But synagogues are not that. They're not governed by temple authorities, for instance. They're not governed by some sort of some sort of documentation or constitution that just is uniform and uniformly applied. So I think that's a really good, very important point to mention, that synagogues are specific. They're local assemblies. They're not manifestations of some sort of super local authority called normative Judaism, which is another kind of term that's now defunct in a lot of early Judaism scholarship. So I think that's a great point, Jared.
Okay, it's interesting on the word thing. Jeremy Williams, in his book Criminalization in Acts of the Apostles, he brings up this issue with the word synedrion. I don't know if you've read the book, and I'm probably saying the word wrong because I remember he had to correct me.
That's good. And I know, so this was a very recent book, yes?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I know Jeremy. I haven't read his book yet, but I know him. He's a fine scholar.
So we spoke a couple of weeks ago, I think it was,
Okay,
and so these episodes will be coming out pretty close together. And
great.
he chose to, yeah, you're in good company, each of you. He chose to render that as the judiciary because, in a very similar way, saying Sanhedrin is confusing
Yeah,
because it evokes an image of a central
yeah,
Supreme Court. And
yeah.
I think, and I brought this up. I'm sorry to keep name dropping, but I am referring
That's
it
okay.
to it so that the listeners can go. But in the episode with John D. Levinson, I referred to an American politician who's mocked for talking about Jewish space lasers. But what she said, and she
Mm,
thought this was a correction, and we don't need to name the name, is that they were um, Rothschild lasers, space lasers.
okay,
And she
okay.
thought that was an adequate correction because she didn't say Jewish space lasers, but she was completely unaware of the long anti Semitic history of heaping scorn on that particular family and that
Mm-hmm.
they have become scapegoats pointed at by anti Semites. And I
Yeah,
think a similar thing happens when you say this word mean they're driven out of the synagogue as
yeah,
anything other than they were being driven out of this structure for this immediate localized conflict, or the
yeah.
Sanhedrin as an overarching Jewish body abusing
Right, right.
justice. That these are all things that
Absolutely.
get collected in our brains. And even if you're not explicitly being what we would think is a foaming at the mouth anti Semite, you are
Right.
participating in something that's keeping that bifurcation there.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you on that, Jared. I think we just talked about also the emergence and development of Christian supersessionism and this idea of Christianity's triumph over Judaism. It's fundamentally built on sort of conceptions of anti-Judaism, which still penetrate a lot of modern day Christianity, right? And so it's only sort of the scholarly trajectory, which is, I think, gaining some traction in lay circles as well, but that's trying to push against that and trying to think in post-supersessionist types of ways because we want to absolutely do everything we can to shed this terrible history that Christianity has of Christian anti-Semitism, and even in the popular arena too, or whether we're talking about Christianity or in the political realm or whatever. But yeah, absolutely. Other terms do this to have done this similar types of work, right? We have Pharisees or the Pharisees, right? Have done this kind of thing where they get imbued with anti overtones, right? In talking about all Jews were Pharisees, and of course we know the Pharisees were just cold, hard legalists and didn't care about they didn't care about God. All they cared about was just oppressing people. And so, absolutely, anti-Semitism drives right a lot of thinking about New Testament texts, about New Testament ideas, and these are the very things that we need to rethink, especially in light of history. Right? I think this is the importance of doing this type of historical critical work, where we can start to unpack and criticize, interrogate the concepts that we use and that we oftentimes assume is just taken for granted or whatever, but they actually have how we've been thinking about these ideas have actually been deeply connected to anti-Semitism. Absolutely. So,
So we're on the back half of the hour, and I want to make
yeah.
sure that you get to say as much as was there something that when you were like, okay, I'm going to talk to this guy about this article today. I'm hoping he asks about this that I did not, which could be almost anything because I follow whatever my brain picks up on. Is there anything that
Yeah,
you
no,
thought I really want to talk about this and it hasn't been brought up so far?
I don't think I'm happy to talk about anything when it comes to John's gospel or particularly John's relationship to Judaism. I'm interested in large swaths of ancient Judaism. So you've done a great job of asking good questions that come right from the work. So I think, yeah, I think you've done a great job of getting me to talk about the things that are really interesting to me. So yeah, I can't think of anything right now, Jared.
Okay, then we can stretch our legs with books. So, where
Yeah.
would you send people to get a better? So they're sitting down with their NIV or NRSV or whatever
Yeah.
translation they read. What other books, or it could be podcasts, and you don't have to say this one because if they're listening to this one, they don't need you to promote it. Are there books, podcasts, YouTube channels, lectures, articles? Where would you send people to get a better understanding of the text that they're reading when they engage with biblical texts?
Yeah, first, maybe I can provide, at least from my own perspective, just some, I guess, advice would be the term. But anytime you pick up a book, put your critical thinking skills on. So should always be engaging critically with whatever you read, no matter from what perspective. So I offer some of these suggestions with that in mind, right? You don't necessarily need to take them wholesale, what they say, but they've been authors especially who have been influential for me and I think are really relevant. And they're not necessarily Johannine scholars either. So some are. So for instance, I think a lot of people, particularly Christian readers of the New Testament, should read work by Adele Reinhartz. Maybe, hopefully, some of listeners will be familiar with her work. One of the most famous, well-known Johannine scholars living today. She's written a lot on anti-Judaism in John's Gospel. And so we actually take a very different approach in our readings of John, but a lot of my ideas have been sharpened in relationship to her thinking. And I think what a lot of her work does is she raises the issue, right? The problem that John presents with some of its language, right? Especially in John 8, where you have Jesus say something like the Jews have the devil as their father. So what does that mean in the context of what we've been talking about here with anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish presuppositions that undergird a lot of Christian interpretation of the New Testament? What do we do with that? Do we try to get John off the hook? Do we try to provide an apology to get John doing what we want it to do? Can we acknowledge that what John has Jesus say is really rotten and not use it as a model for the way that we think about Jewish Christian relations today, so on and so forth? So there's just a lot of her work is fantastic when it comes to getting people to think about the problems that John presents in this issue of Jewish Christian relations. I would also encourage, so this is actually not in Johannine studies, but perhaps some of your listeners will be aware of Mark Nanos's work. Mark Nanos is a Pauline scholar, but he's done a huge deal with reading Paul, right? Reading Paul within Judaism as a full participant, right? In every sense of that term, in the world of Second Temple Judaism. And the reason why I would suggest Mark Nanos and a lot of his work is not only because of his interesting things he has to say about Paul, but because it's been really a generating force in a lot of other New Testament scholarship. So mine as well, for instance, with the Gospel of John. So I would really suggest readers get a hold. Mark also writes with a very accessible, very easy to read type of style. So that would be, I think, really good. Paula Fredrickson is also probably a really important figure to get your hands on. So she's written a lot on Paul, but also on this sort of within Judaism type of approach. And Paula is probably one of the best historians that I know. She's a fantastic historian of the Mediterranean world, going all the way back to the time of Paul and the New Testament, all the way through Augustine. So she's also a scholar of St. Augustine. So one of the best thinkers of our generation, I think. Um, let's see. Also, I'm trying to think if there's any podcasts or other types of things. It's certainly not a podcast genre, but there is an edited volume that I would suggest lay readers get their hands on. A lot of the questions that we've been talking about. It's this one here. Within Judaism, question mark, interpretive trajectories in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam from the 1st to the 21st century. But this is like a condensation of the last maybe like 20 years of scholarship on the relationship between the New Testament and not just the New Testament, but lots of other authors in ancient Christianity, and then even thinking about Islam and the birth of Islam in relationship to Judaism. But really accessible, short chapters that can provide provide your readers, I think, with a sense of what's going on here and this sort of paradigm shift that's happening right now in New Testament studies. I can't think of a podcast. Maybe I'm sure there are some out there, Jared.
There's a ton
I
of
mean,
them,
you
and I
also,
probably already pitched them. Yeah,
yeah,
on
okay,
script is one. Data over dogma is another one.
okay, there you go. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I don't have a weird relationship to the podcasting world, but just it's it's an evolving relationship. How about that?
I
So,
won't hold it. I won't hold that against you.
good.
You're here.
Yeah,
You're on
that's
one,
good.
and
That's
now I
right.
know. Now I know you've never been on any of the other ones.
That's
So
right. That's right.
suck it, data over
Yes.
dogma.
Okay.
No, that was me. That was not Wally. Wally didn't
Yeah.
say that. He does not
No, I
endorse
didn't.
that. But I don't need him to co-sign that because I've met the
It's yours,
Dans
man. It's
and
yours.
I'm
It's
not
your
afraid.
thing.
I'm
Yeah.
not afraid of them. What about just understanding the history better outside of a
Yeah.
biblical context? You just want to get a better
Yeah.
idea of what the ancient world was like. Are there any
Yeah.
historians that you would point people to?
Yeah. So on a number of different fronts here too. So my work a lot coincides with synagogue studies. So in this particular article that we've discussed earlier, it's on the Gospel of John, but I've also been really engaged with ancient synagogue studies as well. And so I would really encourage readers to get to know the synagogue, right? Get to know synagogues in the plural, just to try to provide some contour and nuance, not just to reading the Gospel of John, but reading really a big chunk of the New Testament, to be honest with you. And there's a lot of material that you can get your hands on with that. A lot of good material, I think, as well. So, of course, I'm a little bit biased here because he was my doctoral supervisor, but Anders Runeson, who's a professor of New Testament at the University of Oslo in Norway, has written a lot on early synagogues. He's written, of course, on the origins of the synagogue, but also in the development of synagogues as an institution. So anything by him, you just Google his name, and any work that he's done on synagogues, I think is really solid. There's also a book that is still the standard work in the study of ancient synagogues, not just in the early period that we're talking about with Jesus in the New Testament, but all the way through really the 7th, 8th century AD. Is a big book by the name of Lee Levine. He's a Jewish American scholar, or American Israeli scholar who has worked at Hebrew University in Jerusalem for a long time. So I think he's actually now retired, but he wrote this book on the ancient synagogue, the first 1,000 years. So it's a Yale University Press book. But yeah, if you can track it down at a library or something, I forget exactly how much it costs, so it's probably a little bit expensive. But it's like just a wonderful reference guide to anything having to do with ancient synagogues. So I think that would be good. It's also deeply historical, right? Not just archaeology, but just deeply historical. Lots of references to the New Testament. For something that might be helpful for any reader who is, or listener that is, who's reading the New Testament, but really wants a better snapshot of the early Jewish world that surrounds it, I would still recommend this book. It's called The Introduction to Early Judaism by James Vanderkam. So it's quite old now, 2 decades old, 2000, I think, it was its publication. There might be a second edition out now, but James Vanderkam is a scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls, world authority, but very readable and very well organized book that kind of will get you into thinking about anything from synagogues to Pharisees, Sadducees, the Dead Sea Scrolls, anything that has to do with historical context of the New Testament, right? This period that we sometimes call the Second Temple period. So those would be my suggestions off the start. Of course, there's lots more, and forgive me for not mentioning all of them, but those are some of the key ones that have been important for me.
You're forgiven. You're forgiven for not naming
Thanks.
all of the sources. So I know at the popular level, there were people like, for me, like Tom Holland, where,
Yep.
again, you don't have to validate this if you don't want to, but Persian Fire, he goes
Okay.
into the use of the term "son of God" in
Mm.
reference to a Persian king in a way that was really
Mm.
helpful to like look over at the Bible and be like, does that mean what
Mm.
the post
Mm.
Nicene
Mm.
theology that I had been raised
Yep.
on? Are these terms?
Absolutely. So you just mentioned, as you're reading your Bible specifically, there is also this Jewish annotated New Testament. Amy Jill Levine was, I think, an editor of that. I
Yeah.
think also in collaboration with another
Here,
person,
hold
which
on.
it escapes my mind right now. Sorry about that. Okay, maybe you can pull it off your your shelf. Yeah.
Hold on. I
Yeah.
thought it would
Yep.
be
No
on the
problem.
cover, but it's not. Brettler.
Yeah. There you
Mark
go.
Brettler.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody knows AJ, Amy Jill, but yeah, sorry, I've forgotten Bretler as well. But I think that essentially it's a New Testament, but just highlighted with its sort of rootedness within Jewish context. So I think that type of resource is super helpful for anybody who wants to be directly engaged with your New Testament text, but also be sensitive to issues that we've been talking about today, whether it's terminology, whether it's anti-Semitic presuppositions that oftentimes readers will just put in without even knowing, and like you mentioned, without even trying to be anti-Semitic in their reading, but just you slip into it, or it's a lot of embedded theology. The Jewish Annotated New Testament, I think, would be a great resource. So you probably have already recommended it to your readers, and I would recommend that as well.
No, oddly, it's never come up yet. Thank you for reiterating that point, though. I don't want people to think that I am just throwing out the term and you're an anti-Semite if you're a Christian
No,
sitting in a church reading about. No, that's not. But there can
no,
be things
no,
that you're not aware of that are
absolutely,
from back before
absolutely.
you, and you're still being a part of them. And being aware of that
Yep,
means that you can change them. And I think that's really important.
absolutely. Absolutely. Just to highlight that, I remember so when I was in Oslo doing my PhD, Amy Jo Levine came to Oslo and gave a lecture, one of our sort of invited lecture series, and had a chance to talk with her afterwards a little bit too. And so, at least when she was at Vanderbilt, I think she might have retired at this point. I've lost track of where she is institutionally. But I know she taught a lot in Christian homiletics courses, right? So she actually is like an expert, not just in New Testament, of course, and Jewish studies, but she's taught homiletics as well. So, and one of the main things I think that she felt like was a crucially important thing to do is as you train Christian preachers to train them in ways where they don't just let embedded anti-Semitism spew out of their sermons, right? And so even from early age, right, people who grow up in Christian contexts and just had to go through their sort of, even if it's subtle or unconscious Christian education, they grow up with these sort of anti-Semitic ideas and they have no idea, right? They just, it's an embedded issue, an embedded thing. And so she's done just a fantastic job, not just in helping Christian preachers, but even in children's literature, right? So she's published some children's books that try to teach things like the parables, right, of the New Testament, or other kinds of stories from the New Testament, but highlighting and trying to actively work against anti-Semitic presuppositions that are oftentimes brought by Christian readers. So yeah, so it's not to throw that term around lightly, and it's not to say that all Christians are anti-Semites, but it is a problem, right? You need and it's a huge problem, and we need to call it for that and try to work against our blind spots, right? We all have blind spots. We all have things that we need to be reminded of or taught to begin with, and so I think these are all really important aspects.
She is certainly a force to be reckoned with because she is everywhere, and she's one of those Richard Horsley types who have just published a ton of stuff on just about
Sure.
everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's great, wonderful scholarship. Yep.
What do you read for fun?
When I have a chance to read for fun. Let's see. Do you want the honest answer?
Yes,
I mean, it's like nothing too crazy, but I've gotten into there's actually audiobooks. Do audiobooks count?
of course they do.
Yeah, okay, great. As long as audiobooks
I
count,
would never
good.
meet my Goodreads reading goal if I didn't include audiobooks.
Okay, fair enough. I have really gotten into the Andy Serkis readings of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And actually, he also does the Hobbit as well. So I'm big into Lord of the Rings stuff and then other surrounding literature, but as read and performed by Andy Serkis. He's, of course, everybody knows how great he is with his voice acting, but it's just every time I flip my headphones on and listen to a book that he narrates, it blows my mind. So I've really enjoyed that. It's like a whole new reading experience when you listen to him.
I
So I've enjoyed that. That's been a big thing. Yep.
I imagine that he's really good. If I may make a recommendation to you in a similar vein,
Sure.
the
Please.
audiobook of Watership Down, and I don't remember who it was
Okay.
who narrated it, but I remember reading Watership Down years ago and my heart just pounding because The
Well,
Hobbit, it's just something is
yeah.
always happening.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
remember I was listening to it because I was going to be talking about it in an interview for the podcast. And so I was re-listening to the book, and whoever that guy was, I should probably remember his name. Uh, there were scenes that I felt stressed out. I would have,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
the tension, he had built the tension so well. I
Yep.
would have to pause it and go back to a podcast or music or
Yeah.
something. So that one's
Yeah.
fantastic. And I don't know how much you like sci-fi, but Jefferson Mays, I think, is the guy who narrates the Expanse series. And it's a
Okay.
nice
Okay.
long chunk of books. There's 9 books, and then there's a bunch of novellas, but he's the same
Cool.
guy. And he
Cool.
does such a good job of voicing every character and just
Cool.
doing all the different points of view.
It's
Sorry,
amazing. No, that's great. No, I'm fascinated by these voice actors who can just, on a dime, just enter into a new persona, new voice, new everything. And it's
if it's
amazing.
not, what if it's not on a dime though? I'm imagining that they're just like
Uh,
really over the top and
yeah,
high maintenance.
maybe, and maybe there's, of course, they can edit stuff or whatever. But I don't know. It's just really cool. I've really appreciated the audio. I've never been skeptical of the audio, but just finally have gotten into it as a routine in my life, and I like it. It's nice. It's
I
great.
think I'm assuming that you're from the US. Am I
Yeah,
right?
I am.
Okay.
I am.
I think we're probably similar ages, and
Yep.
we were told if we read this many books, we'd get to go to Pizza Hut and get our personal
Yeah,
pan pizza.
absolutely. On the
And if
reading list. Yeah.
yeah, and so anything less than just reading it is cheating. And
Yeah. Yep.
but yeah, no, I finally got over that hump of wait, no, I'm still getting the story, and
Yeah.
I can listen to it way more than I can read it because I'm a slow reader.
So same here. Absolutely. So I'm right there with you. It actually helps me get through a book
Yep.
rather than getting bogged down in the same paragraph over and over again. Absolutely. And the ear is also a muscle in the sense that the more you listen, the better listener that you become. And so I've noticed that I can actually I can hold my attention for longer when I'm listening to a lecture now or something like that, just because I'm doing this more and more. So I'm all for it.
What is there anything other than reading or audiobooks that you do to decompress? Because you were one of those who wasn't quick to throw out books, but
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so I've got two young kids. I've got a 6 and an 8-year-old. And it's hard to just get like quiet time to just decompress. I do enjoy spending time with my kids, and that's a good distraction for me. I'm buried in work or something. It's nice to be able to go home and be with them. They keep me grounded in things that matter. My work matters too, but it's different. But I'm not musical necessarily. I'm not a musical person, like in the sense of talent, but I really do enjoy playing the ukulele. So that's the kind of thing that just a complete distraction. Something gets me using another side of my brain, and I've been out of it for a while now because for different reasons. But I really do enjoy something that I can get my hands moving and then also activate some other kind of senses. So ukulele playing is fun.
I think that's
Yeah.
the most interesting answer I've gotten so far. So
Oh,
I'll
cool.
tell you
Okay.
this.
Well,
I'll tell
so
you this. Best
yeah.
beard so far,
Okay.
and
Really?
most interesting answer. Yep, hands
Okay.
down,
Oh,
best
that's
beard so
great.
far. And
I'm super flattered by
listeners,
that.
sorry you don't get to see this, but best beard. So Google him.
Nice. Oh, that's great, Jared. I feel really happy about that now. And if you think the ukulele is an interesting answer, I actually should be more specific, okay? It's actually the banjolele. So it's a cross between a ukulele and a banjo.
Okay,
And
now you're
so
just showing off.
that's no,
Now
no,
you're
no.
just
Like
showing
so
off.
I mean it plays like a ukulele, like it's 4 strings, whatever. So it's not like super fancy, but the drum and everything is a banjo, and it's great. I discovered it in Oslo, and but then I ordered one when I was back in the States, and it was great. So, anyways, yeah. So that's it.
That's cool, man. Okay, Wally Cirafesi, unless you have anything else, I'm going to call this one good.
No, yeah, this is great. I really appreciate it. I think we've talked about some important stuff, also some fun stuff. So thanks for having me, Jared.
Take care, man.
Thanks.